Hi everybody. Today I've got a fun demonstration on painting prickly pear cactus from life in the Red Rock landscape. And we'll be focusing mainly on major shapes, value structure, composition, temperature, and of course color. And the major color is going to be the variety of greens. So we'll be looking at how to mix different greens from a primary palette. And I love that the part of the background is the red rocks, because red and green are complementary colors, and I feel like that's one of the reasons that they're so appealing in the southwestern landscape. You've got that beautiful complementary relationship happening. Thank you for being here and for watching. I hope you enjoy this video. If you do, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And I'd love to know in the comments if you prefer just the plein air landscape painting or if you also enjoy some other subjects. Thanks again, and see you next time. So here's my primary palette. I've just squeezed out some Cad Yellow Medium, which is my warm yellow. Now the Ultramarine Blue, Yellow Ocher. I do have one earth tone, Titanium White. Try to have a warm and a cool of each primary color, and that just helps to create more variety. Now my Alizarin Crimson, which is a cool red. Adding Cerulean Blue Hue, which is a cool blue shade. And then my Cad Lemon Yellow, my cool yellow. I've got a good pile of Cad Red Medium, so I've just added the Cad Red Light, and now I'm getting started right into the wash, and I'm basically just using some of that cadmium red medium and wiping it down so that it doesn't tint my block in too much, but also so that it covers the white of my panel. And I'm working on a pretty small size. I've got an 8x6 vertically formatted panel. It's a clay board, I believe, which is a nice surface. I usually work with that or gessobord. And I've mixed a little bit of ultramarine blue with alizarin crimson to create my sketch here. And you can see the prickly pear that I'm working with. It's actually right in my front yard here in Sedona, next to this beautiful yucca plant. So I'm feeling out the shapes. I like this little prickly pear cactus patch because there's just a really nice variety of shape. There's different heights. There's not of like repeating paddle patterns, which sometimes you see in the prickly pear. So it can become a little repetitive. I've got a really great cluster here. So this is going to be my main mass. This is a pretty different approach to generally my landscape painting, where I block in the main masses. You know, even a little bit different than some floral compositions. I'm really kind of illustrating each paddle shape, and that feels supportive because there's enough variety of shape, big, small, rounded edges, more angular edges. And I really want to create that sense of overlap. So I'm basically really directly translating each individual shape as I see it in front of me. And everything outside of the paddle shapes is the background. So obviously I'm not really, worried about painting in the rocks or shadows or anything just yet. So I've taken a little bit of Alizarin Crimson, Ultramarine Blue, Cad Red Medium, and filling in that negative space. And a little bit of the darker sections too. So adding more ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson to where it gets more shaded. And finding, where those major shadow shapes are, and then I'll kind of tweak that a bit later. But like I said, kind of just trying to block in the background is more of a mass. The road is the background for the higher paddles. So I've mixed a little bit of white into that purpley mixture, the ultramarine blue and the Cad or alizarin crimson. And I'll create a nice gradient there towards the end of the painting. But for now, just super simplified colors. You could say that, more towards the foreground is warmer, and as you go further back towards the road, it's cooler. But this is creating a nice sense of space in the painting, even though, it's a super close-up kind of detail of these prickly pears. So when I'm mixing my greens, it's typically a combination of my blue and yellow. So I've just pulled from my ultramarine blue and Cad Yellow Medium, and then some Cad Red Medium. So this is going to be a more neutral green, meaning I have pretty equal parts of blue and yellow and a little bit of that red, meaning that it's not leaning too heavily towards blue or yellow or red. And that's really what mixing greens boils down to when you don't have actual green pigments. You're always asking, is this green more blue, or is it more red, or is it more yellow? Is it warmer or cooler, more saturated or more neutral? Is it darker or lighter? So you can see I'm also creating a bit of a gradient here. I've got my darkest pigment, and then I slowly add whatever yellow or white that I'm using within the gradient. The second mixture here is more red leaning, and I've used that for some of the prickly pears that aren't as vibrant, that are maybe in the process of dying. This green that I'm mixing is more on the yellow side. I've got ultramarine and Cad Lemon, a little bit of the Cad Red Light, and you'll be able to see very clearly when I'm applying these colors to the panel what I mean by, is the green more blue, red, or yellow? This mixture is definitely going to be more blue leaning. So I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue and even a little bit of that cerulean just to cool it a little bit, because it's kind of like a cool blue. That paddle is also reflecting a lot of the light. So it's a blue with, you know, yellow in it. And those are really just the basics on mixing greens with a primary palette. You can see how much possibility there is when you don't actually have the green pigment, because you're no longer looking at it as green, but as a combination of different colors. And this will be more complex when it's a landscape painting and you're introducing things like atmosphere and more surrounding chroma and value. But these are just really the key basics. And when I'm painting, I've got these kind of main piles, and I can adjust them as I'm painting, because oftentimes I'll put a color down and it'll actually look a little bit different in life than it does when I'm putting it down. So I'll adjust accordingly by saying, oh, that's actually a little bit warmer, or, you know, I have to cool that off a little, or that's got a lot more yellow in it than what I mixed. So it's helpful to kind of mix these colors in the beginning, but throughout the painting, I'll be constantly adjusting them based on what I'm seeing in reality. And I'll speak to that as I continue to blacken my sketch. Now, I'm going to be approaching this a little bit differently. I'm not doing my darkest darks first. I'm actually doing medium to lights first, but I'm applying them pretty thinly so that I can easily paint into them. The reason I'm doing this is because I have a lot of blocks of these middle lighter values, and I really don't have a lot of contrast or darks at all. But the darks that I am seeing are so up close that you can really see into them. So painting with a mixture that's a bit lighter is going to actually be of benefit. So that was a decision that was made very intentionally. And you can see I've already laid in those two paddles that are definitely cooler with more blue tones and getting more of that direct light hitting them. I have this other paddle in between that's really angled, so it's almost just like a sliver of light and shadow. And I've got another one right next to it, but it's feeling a little busy, so I might just kind of sweep that out with the background pavement color here. But like I said, I've got my main masses blocked in, and I'm going to be still adjusting those at this phase, subtracting and adding, seeing where things overlap, where I want to take shapes out or add them in. And you can also see a little bit of variety already in the greens. So my really, more neutral, warmer green is going down a little bit in that overlap. And that's got a nice combination of the Cad Yellow Medium and the Cad Red Medium with my Ultramarine blue. And with green, as I spoke to before, green and red are complements. So, by virtue of mixing more red into your green combination, you'll desaturate the color a little bit. So you can see how desaturated that green behind is in comparison to this green I just laid down, which is a little bit stronger on the cadmium yellow medium side. You can see how it's both warmer and just the local color of the cactus is more yellow. You can really see with these petals, you know, not even in any direct light at all, how they trend towards more blue or more yellow, which is really, it's a fun observation, and it makes our lives easier as artists. We have this beautiful variety of color. So you can see also where I've kind of taken that other little sliver of a petal out, and now on the bottom corner, I'm adding a little bit a darker value of the cactus that is clearly underneath. And there's a little bit more of that background red in there, so it feels like this patch is emerging from the earth. And that's always important to consider, the background colors and the shapes that are closest to them, adding some of that in so that it feels cohesive and harmonious. Here is a nice middle shade of a green that has a little bit more blue in it. Obviously not as cool or as blue as some of those background petals. This has a nice mixture still of a little bit of red and yellow, but you can see that the main mixture is going to be cadmium lemon yellow with ultramarine blue. A little bit of that red in there too. So it's not such a punchy green. And taking some of that color and placing it down at the bottom here. You can see on a lot of these petals that some of them are much lighter. So what I'm putting down now is just kind of like the block-in color, but I'll be tweaking it with adding temperature and value still, so keeping that in mind. With these two foreground cacti, you can see the one that's more in the forefront does have more saturation. The one behind it is a little bit more tonal, a little more neutral. So you've got a little bit more red in it. And I do tend to outline the sides of the cactus a little to make the overlaps clear. But you can actually do that with just the shapes. If the temperature and color is different, they will read as separate shapes, either closer or farther. They will be able to be distinguished from one another. And that was a really huge realization I had in painting, was that I didn't have to make shapes clear just by outlining them. I could really do that by a subtle understanding of even just temperature and tonality and value, not even the color. And I'm now reading into some of these shapes a bit more. You can see definitely where the edges too play a role. Some of the edges are quite soft and others are harder, meaning that, you know, you'll see sharper lines on some of the contours, whereas it'll be more blended and soft on others. This side angled cactus is really cool that I just painted. It's actually got a little bit of a purple hue to it. Some cactus in Sedona are actually purple, which those are just totally different to paint. But this one definitely is going to be more of a violet mixture. It has that beautiful Alizarin Crimson with Ultramarine Blue, and then a little bit of Cad Yellow Medium, because, you know, we're not going for super saturated violet here. It's all about the greens and a little bit of that red. Now I'm just adding in a little bit of that shadow on this plane of the cactus, where you can see that there's some overlapping happening. And that really helps to bring this form into the third dimension. Now you're modeling these forms by showing how this paddle is casting a shadow on the one behind it. And that shadow wants to be the same color, in that same color family as the plane that it's falling on. So now I've added another paddle that is a lot more in shadow. So even though it's not totally in shadow, I'm going to be working with a darker value there. So I blocked in that shape with the darker green. The one in front of it is leaning a little bit more into the light, but you can see how they're both still angled away from the light. So how I communicate that is through that darker middle value, and then you can also see how the gradient is important, how I mix my dark and my light, and then directly on the panel there I can mix that middle tone. To further illustrate that those paddles are facing away from the light, I'm communicating that highlight right on the rim of the paddles. And that highlight is going to be within the same color mixture as that particular paddle. So you can see the one behind has a little more blue, and the one in front of it is more of a yellow and more saturated highlight. These paddles that I'm painting now have more blue, and they're really just catching that light. They're angled right towards the light. So that is all going to be a higher value. And just with a very subtle line, I've communicated the shape of the paddle from the shadow that it's casting, and also where the two paddles are attached. So there's a little bit of that dark, a little bit more outline where they connect. And for that color, I'm generally using like an ultramarine blue with a alizarin crimson, teeny little bit of yellow, but not very much. And I'm blending right directly on the panel here. I'm adding a little bit more light to where that paddle kind of just slightly curves away from the sun. And sometimes you can see that there's like higher chroma too in between those planes where an object is turning. And the shadow has expanded a little bit on this form, so I've taken it up further on the plane of that big paddle cactus. And there's a little bit more light towards the top there. You can see where I've added that contour line between the highlight and the main mass. So that's also a thing that happens with shapes that are shaded. That place where it goes from shadow into light feels like it appears to be a darker line. There's also this casted shadow over here on this corner paddle. And now that I've got so many of my shapes blocked in, I can kind of see where the design isn't totally clear here. So I'm using this shadow to carve that out and going back in with a little bit of a stronger saturated color and a little bit lighter too, so it's not blending so much into the background. And that is a really juicy green. That's got a lot of nice yellow and blue mixed together. A lot of this color mixing really happens very intuitively, so the best way I can simplify it is by just constantly looking and saying, is that warmer, is that cooler, but also in relation to the greens that are next to it. So there's actually this extra little paddle that I'm carving out there. So I've made a little bit of an outline. Now I'm going to go in with that lighter bluish color, which is getting more sunlight on it. And now you're really going to see more clearly how that's the paddle that's creating that cast shadow on the one behind it. So that's an important thing to note when you're out in the field too. If you're creating a shadow, it really helps the viewer to see where that shadow is coming from. Again, it just brings these shapes into more of a three-dimensional reality. And I apologize for so much of that glare on the panel. It can be very challenging to really get good lighting in the field, especially when you're videotaping it. There is a little bit of that really interesting shadow that's popping up on that cactus in between also. So I've added that, and you can really see like this cascade of prickly pears, which is how I want it to feel. I just want you to feel like you're, right up in this patch, and that there's not confusion of shapes, that it, makes sense where all these shapes are coming from, but it also has a little bit of that obscurity in the background to where your mind can kind of go in a little bit to imagining or experiencing. Mixing a little bit more titanium white into those original color mixtures. And you can see where starting with that middle value has created such a nice luminosity. It really feels like the shapes and the shadows are alive, and there's definitely this sense of the light hitting these forms. I think I explained in my previous video how, when there's more shadow or when you're closer up to shadow, you can see into it a little bit more. But when you're farther away or the shadow shapes are very small, you can't see into the shadow as much. So that's something to also bring that observation to life, is not making them too dark, making sure that I'm having enough light running into them. And I've added those ground plane shadows as well. So the cactus are reflecting their shadows onto the red rock landscape. And so those have a lot more red in the mixture, red and blue, not as much yellow. But I love how you have that vibration, that harmonization that happens when you look at the red and the green next to each other. With these paddles that are more towards the bottom, I've really got, a little bit more orange or brown even, not really a lot of green happening at all. So we can get into autopilot when we're mixing greens and saying, okay, every mixture has to start with like a lot of ultramarine and yellow. But it was when I stopped doing that I really started to pay attention to the subtleties. And so, if you're looking at a color in a cactus and your mind wants to say that's green, it's a cactus, but you look at it and you say, okay, it's a cactus, but it's actually brown. So that was kind of like groundbreaking for me, just simply observing and witnessing rather than just allowing the mind to create what it thinks it's seeing. So I've got a really nice brown mixture when I mix like a Cad Red Medium and Cad Yellow Medium. And then also mixing in some of that ultramarine blue because I don't want it to be, a fiery orange. Brown kind of requires a little bit of that blue in there too. But sometimes, like when you get to more of the bottom of the patch, you can see like where some of those petals are rotting or dying, giving themselves to new life. So that is a really beautiful process where you're seeing less of those vibrant greens and more of those browns and grays. So even though this composition in this particular patch feels very vibrant with the colors that I've chosen, I've still got a lot of those neutrals that are illustrating more of the natural colors that are happening. And now, as this piece continues to dry in the sun, I can really add more of those highlights or go into those highlights, continue to make them lighter, and going into the paddles where they are getting more light on them and mixing just, the titanium or that particular yellow into that, and making sure that my brush marks are going all different directions so that they don't feel so flat. They feel like very alive and voluminous is a good word. I like to use that when I'm talking about clouds too, but the prickly pear, they are very flat, so there's a balance there. And you can see where I'm going back into redefining some of those shadow and light areas, and even still adjusting the temperature and the chroma so that aspects of the paddle are popping out and others recede. And now that I've, basically finished painting all the cactus, I'm just gonna really quickly refine a little bit of that background and really just blending those background colors and where they meet the cactus, and blending that violet that is happening in the road with the red rock color to make a gradient that's pleasing to the eye. Make sure it's falling away so that the cactus are, really the main focus. And working on these edges too, you can see where some of that underpainting is still around the edges. And sometimes I like to leave them, but here I think it helps to really refine those shapes by blending them into the background. And there's also a little bit of highlight, a little bit of, like simple rock details that I can put in a very gestural way, giving just a little amount of detail to the background, which is not necessary, but I think it does help a little to add those in. Now for my final details here, I'm adding those little dots on the paddles with my darker value. Some of them are a little more green, some are, more red, a little more warm. And I'm using my palette knife to illustrate those glochids, those spikes. And that's the finished piece. Stay tuned for Mixing Greens Part 2 and have a beautiful week.